So, hi everyone. I'm here with Orlando Wood today. He's the Chief Innovation Officer for System One, and you're sort of in the advertising space, consumer psychology kind of space. And I know you've written a couple of books. You've written a book called Lemon and Lookout around. You've studied
That's
advertising
right.
pretty much for all of your career, and you also run a course as well,
That's
APE, which
right.
is Advertising Principles Explained,
Correct.
which is also very interesting as well. And we'll put a link to that as well in the comments
Thank you.
below for sure.
Well,
So,
thanks for
welcome.
having me, Chris, and good to be here.
So we first met, I suppose, I heard you talk at least at MadFest, and you gave this great presentation talking about the difference between showmanship and salesmanship. And so for me, being very much a sort of like a numbers guy, it was a real kind of eye opener in terms of like how we got to think about how we interact with people. Maybe just explain just a little bit around what that kind of means and what you kind of meant by that and why that's kind of important a little bit.
Of course, yes, we're happy to. Yes, you're quite right. I was giving a talk about these two schools of advertising. One that I describe as showmanship, the other as salesmanship. And both of these schools have a very long history, going back to the late 19th century, really. And they both do different things. You look back at the origins of advertising and mass reach advertising, and it's quite clear that, both its origins and its effectiveness is kind of rooted in its ability to put on a show and in art as well. You look back to the 1890s, 1880s, and it was in Paris that you saw the first color poster ads on a mass produced scale through lithography starting to take root and be used. And it was the shows of the period, from Montmartre, Le Moulin Rouge, Les Bergères, all of these great cabarets that were popping up at the time that made use of this new poster to advertise the performers of the time, but also the venue. And it was the artists, of course, Toulouse-Lautrec, Jules Chéret, Bonnard, Pierre Bonnard, who were creating these posters. So you look back at the history of that mass reach advertising, it's clear that art and the show were absolutely central to it. And manufacturers, of course, then followed suit. But then in sort of about 1905, 1910, you get the rather serious and self-appointed scientists of North America. So Albert Lasker, Claude Hopkins, Johnny Kennedy, who through a slightly different medium, so largely through split tests on print advertising, looking at different versions of print advertising and how well people responded to the coupons in those ads, you get a different kind of approach to advertising emerging that you might call salesmanship. And they believed it wasn't about capturing the sort of general interest of an audience, but speaking to people who were already kind of half with you, half interested, and giving them a reason why they should buy. And so this is a very different style of advertising, different school. And they didn't like the image much. They preferred the word. And, they couldn't be further apart, really, at the first glance, these two schools. And what becomes clear is that, 100 years later, well, we know a lot more now about how advertising works. Both of these schools still exist. Both are important, but I think it's become clear through the research of many people, my colleagues from the IPA, fellow authors, but me as well, that it's showmanship that's the more important for profit and growth. It makes your salesmanship work harder, and yet we live today in a world dominated by salesmanship advertising.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's interesting? And we do live in this sort of data world kind of today, which is
Yeah.
supposed to the salesmanship piece. I mean, but do you think it's a cyclical thing? So you're talking back through almost like historical examples, and I was actually thinking of sort of, the American West in the times of, where they had advertising around this will cure everything. That's very sort of like a
Yes.
salesmanship type approach. I mean, do you think we're in this sort of, it's a natural cycle where we go through sort of salesmanship that sort of comes in to sort of counteract the showmanship, and then it's like salesmanship becomes too much, like we want to have a bit more emotion to sort of within our advertising as
It
well to
it
feel around products.
it is a bit cyclical, and it's also partly governed by the media available at any given time and the advent of new media and where the sweet spot for that new medium is. We've seen a shift in advertising from the 70s, 80s, and 90s following the creative revolution. You'll be able to remember some wonderful ads, no
Yeah, I
doubt, from
remember
that
those. Remember
period.
those. They add to my
Uh,
childhood, really.
well, it's not just because we were younger, I think, that we remember them, because there were some really wonderful showmanship ads that were all about narrative, drama, creating an emotional response, lodging the brand in memory. That's what showmanship really is there to do, to create salience and preference. And since the sort of digital revolution, 2000, 2005, where we've got media that make it much easier now to target people, we're now giving people salesmanship because we think all we have to do is be relevant to these people, and we don't have to entertain them. We don't have to capture their attention because they're already there. It's made us creatively lazy, I think. And so we've seen this massive swing, as I show in my books, away from showmanship towards salesmanship in the last 20 years. And it's impacting on advertising effectiveness.
But
And advertising effectiveness has fallen in that period.
I look back through one of your previous talks. I was watching that earlier. So like you pinpointed it down to 2005. I thought that was
Yeah,
very
2005, 2006.
yeah.
That's
And I was saying, oh, what's changed? I went back and looked up. That was the year that YouTube launched. Facebook started as well. So it really feels like this media piece that kind of has really driven it, is what you're saying.
Yes,
and the way we
it
interact
is.
with it, mass media.
You're right. And the ability to give people instant data on how things are performing that may only tell part of the story, that may not tell you actually how well going to lodge in the general public's memory and create lasting effects. It will work now or it will not work at all, is kind of how it works. And we've sort of forgotten how this showmanship really works. And that's why I created my course, to help people with that. But yes, that's right. And of course, that's the period in which you see a move towards short-termism, to short-term objective setting, really the inability to think for the long term. And it's all coincided as well with EPOS data. So, the ability to look at sales on a very immediate basis, rather than waiting a month to see how you're doing. Do you know what I mean? So this this ability to measure and digitization all come together, but it doesn't capture the broader effects of advertising. It only looks at what's happening here and now.
I mean, we all remember adverts. I say very much in my childhood. I mean, I remember, a finger of fudge is not enough. I remember about the Hovis man, but I'm not sure if I know how many grams of protein there was in an SY drink in history, right? Or if I remember that in 30 years.
Or even from yesterday, if you saw it then. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, no, absolutely. No, and that was, I mean, the advent of television, it got going properly in the 60s and 70s, and color television, of course. It's a broad reach medium. It's a rich audio-visual medium that can create an emotional response that has long attention spans, so you can create narratives. And that's important for showmanship, because you're speaking to a broad audience and you can't necessarily rely on them to be interested immediately in your product. You have to create a kind of broad narrative, a scene, something that's inherently interesting to people before you bring it into what the product's all about.
How much do you think that's changing, I suppose, even today? Because, social media has been around, let's say, since 2005. But even now, it's kind of changed, with there's so much proliferation of different types of channels that are out there. There's so much content out there. And it feels like, certainly, I'm being much more choosy around what I pick to watch versus. So it's almost like, is that emotional connection becoming more important now? Even though we've still got all the data, it's like, how do I decide what I want to watch? Because you look at the advent of TikTok as an example, the ones that resonate are the ones that have that emotional connection.
Yes.
Even on YouTube videos, right? Or they're like these kind of videos, it's like the ones that people want to see are the ones that are unusual, the ones that are a little bit different, maybe a little bit more edgy, rather than just straightforward talks.
Absolutely. In recent work that I've done and that my colleagues have done at System One, which is a measurement company that looks at the effectiveness of advertising, helps advertisers to improve their work, we found, working with TikTok, that these two schools of advertising exist there too. So, you've got sort of advertising that I describe as salesmanship advertising, which is very direct. It has words on the screen. There's no narrative. It's very product focused from the get-go, and probably has short, sharp cuts, very rhythmic. You can imagine the kind of advertising I'm talking about. So that drives conversion, so short-term sales uplift, but isn't good at all at creating awareness more broadly, at creating sort of trust image type effects. Whereas showmanship drives the conversion, but it also creates salience, preference, image improvements, helps to put things in memory. Those two schools exist today on TikTok, and they exist today not only on TikTok advertising, but when you look at advertising, I suppose, well, modern influencer to creator content, if you like, those schools exist there too. The more direct, and then the more kind of narrative, character-based sort of work.
Yeah, I mean, it is very much around sort of, you know, almost that transactional, what am I going to get from it, which seems to be sort of like, so that's almost like the easiest way to think about it. How much money is it? Am I getting it cheaper versus how do I feel about it? I mean, as we're talking at home here around, a rather, a coffee shop, right, as an example. It's like, is it really about the coffee, or is it about how I feel when I actually buy the coffee? And probably the latter is probably more powerful than the former.
Yes, and it's probably quite difficult to disentangle one from the other. The feeling is the more important sort of halo kind of, it gives a halo to everything else, including the taste of the coffee. So that's quite right. And I think what I show in my books, what I assert and argue in my books, is that we've seen this shift culturally in society from a period that was in many ways quite romantic in the best possible sense, in the sense that it was interested in people, place, had an awareness and interest in what has gone before in history and all these sorts of things. You can see it in films and hear it in music, towards a more transactional kind of world, which is very much now, and more impulsive, and that's more direct, and also has lost. There is sort of a loss of emotional expressivity and the ability to understand emotion on others too. I think you see that quite clearly over the last 20 to 25 years. And by the way, this isn't the only time when this has happened. This sort of happened in about 1500 with the invention of the printing presses. This period of directness and this period of, I'm right, you're wrong. It can only be looked at this one way with the Reformation, And that was you have to go back that far really to see an innovation as far-reaching as the internet, and it was publishing back in about that time. So that's one of the things I talk about in my book, Look Out.
I mean, it's kind of an interesting reflection you have on society as well, in terms of like these different schools of thought. I mean, I know your background was history way back. I
Yes,
think you're
yes.
even going back to Roman times as well, in terms of like.
I think
I mean, I
in
thought that was
Lemon, yes, I do.
that
Yeah.
was fascinating in terms of like the change that took place in society, but also the echoes of some of that today.
Yes, this sort of directness, and by the way, yes, I talk about Emperor Diocletian and shifts in architectural style, and shifts in, if you look at busts from the period, very expressive faces suddenly become very blank stares, devoid of emotion and feeling. And actually, it was one of the things I've shown that's happened in advertising recently, is in the last, 15 to 20 years, you get the rise of the stare, this sort of blank, very quite threatening, coercive looking stare. It's almost the total absence of an idea and absence of emotion. It is, just people staring at you. And people don't like that. They look away. It feels, don't know, threatening in some way. So the stare, which, by the way, was also a feature of modernism back in about 1905, 1910. We go back to the Reformation, we go back to Diocletian again. But, you see these periods where society just kind of freezes a bit. You get that sort of fearfulness on the face, and that stare, that blank stare. So yeah, but time to bring back some emotion, I think, in everything that we do.
What do you think the impact of those changes are, almost like culturally as well? I mean, I guess go back to the adverts of the 70s and the 80s, and they were kind of cultural moments. We can literally all talk about them, right? I just wonder how much that sort of brings culture together. Certainly in the
Yes.
UK was where I grew up. We can all talk about that's a common cultural heritage
Yes.
to a
A
certain extent.
bond, really. Yeah.
Yeah, that we can all talk about. And certainly in other markets, I'm sure it would be the same. Well, do you remember such and such advert? Like,
Well,
I
at the
wonder if we've
time,
lost that, right?
that's right. And at the time, people did talk about them. Have you seen that ad, the latest ad for Carling Black Label or whatever
Yeah.
it might be?
Double Diamond, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking back to the Nescafe Gold Blends ads with the couple. Will they, won't they get together? And that they would advertise the ad that was coming up because it was the next in a sort of series. And you don't really see that sort of thing anymore. And those characters, which, by the way, I've shown in my work, in the period that digital media, digital advertising was starting to take off, characters almost disappeared from advertising. I call them fluent devices, these characters that, like the meerkat, compare the meerkats, Alexander, that kind of character has become less used, less popular in this very direct age. I think you're seeing signs of it coming back now because we know they're effective. But those mascots, they went for a time, and everything just felt a bit less interesting, really, less human.
Yeah, so I suppose you can see, I mean, we all know the power of that in terms of remembering it. It's almost like trying to bring some of that stuff back because clearly it's powerful in terms of making people feel about products. And then that's got a benefit, I suppose, from a revenue
Yeah,
sales kind of point of view as well.
absolutely.
What are some of the things that we should think about to sort of bring some of that back? What are some of the principles that I know you kind of talk about?
Well, I think that marketeers, the big thing for marketeers to think about, I talk about at System 1, the 3 Fs: fame, feeling, and fluency. Can you create fame? So it's really important to be top of mind, even in a world with, sort of SEO, Google, chat bots, everything else. It's first of all, there's a search engine in your head that happens first. So you've got to create fame. You've also got to create feeling. So you've got to try and create this sort of affect heuristic in people because, if I feel slightly better about one option than the other, and I don't really want to spend too much time thinking about it, I'll go for the one I like more, so the affect heuristic, feeling. And then the third one is fluency. So how do you make yourself instantly thought of, instantly recognizable when you're, in this category and you're thinking about this category? So that's where what I describe as fluent devices. So recurring characters, recurring scenarios, should have gone to Specsavers. You're not you when you're hungry, Snickers, that sort of advertising is very helpful. Of course, font shapes, logos, colors, all those sorts of things are very helpful too, but they don't live, and they're less inherently good at capturing your attention and creating an emotional response. So fame, feeling, and fluency is the first thing I would say. And then there are certain ways in which that points you towards showmanship advertising, because showmanship is the advertising that creates salience, creates preference, lodges you in memory through emotion. And then in my course, I talk about how you do that and what advertising has to look like, really, or what it, to give you your best chance of success. Nothing is foolproof, but how do you create that kind of work that does all those things?
I mean, obviously, like the last few years, and certainly over, like the pandemic, I suppose, really since 2008, we've been sort of dealing in quite a sort of constrained kind of economic environment, haven't we? I mean, it's been tough for businesses. And I mean, has that been a factor as well as sort of almost like going for I need the immediate sales versus this longer term piece? How do you justify, I suppose, the investment in what are probably admittedly longer term kind of, longer burn kind of campaigns that build emotion, build brand, that arguably, and you would argue that they have more power, but they take a while to build. How do you balance the two, and how do you justify it?
Yes. And that, I mean, the first thing to say is that showmanship works straight away, but it also lasts longer. So its effects build and build and build. Whereas salesmanship, as I said, it will either work straight away or not at all. And it depends on whether you're speaking to the right people in the buying window who've already been warmed up to your brand or not, probably by your showmanship advertising. So showmanship makes your salesmanship work harder, but we find ourselves in a salesmanship rut, really. And it's a bit chicken and egg, times are tough, so we'll just do the salesmanship. So actually, but because we're only doing the salesmanship, we're not building our salience, we're not building our preference. So we'll just end up in a bit of a death spiral, and you won't grow that way. Not easily, not, I mean, nothing's easy, but showmanship will help you, it will turbocharge your salesmanship. So, we've forgotten that. And I think we live in a technological, sort of engineering-led world that perhaps for whom, the ideas of narrative, metaphor, humor, they feel less direct and they're more difficult to sell in. They're more difficult for people to understand why that's important. And that's why my work and what I'm doing is trying to create the language to articulate why it is that's absolutely fundamental if you're going to do the salesmanship job and do it well.
I mean, it feels like this is another edge. If people are doing that, there's another edge that they've got to think about. I mean, it's even a bit like trying to get out there. We were at a conference, right? So it's like, how do you get out there and meet different people? How do you sort of be visible? And it's not about whether that results in something as much as like I suppose there's a showmanship angle to that, to a certain extent, in a similar kind of analogy, which is being out there without necessarily being an immediate return, but over the longer term, it probably builds to something. I mean, there might be no difference, is it?
I mean, look, if you're trying to create a profile on a social media platform, you can't just dip in and dip out. You have to be there constantly and consistently and interestingly and with freshness. And that is the lesson of showmanship as well. It's not all transactional at all. In fact, you have to do those other broader human things.
What about creativity? Because one of the things definitely around in the showmanship is like some of them they used to, and they're just incredibly creative, right? In terms of coming up with these ideas and, things coming out from left field, and they really make you laugh and they have that emotional kind of reaction. We have a lot of talk about AI, I suppose, going on at the moment. And what do you think the impact is going to be of that? I mean, you can create some of these things. We can create advertising or, video content as an example very easily these days. But is that going to make us, because it's almost like following a pattern of what's gone before, is that going to make us more dull? Or is that going to actually enable more creativity? Because that's like there's another turning point.
I think, it only a fool would predict the future. So let's have a go. The thing is, I've got a lot of sympathy for what you say because it gets you to an answer, probably tries to get you to the answer, doesn't it? And so everyone will be getting to the same answer unless we're asking different questions. And it does still rely on some kind of operator at the moment to do that. I think if we just step back a little bit, one of the things I explore in my course is what the creative process is. And to create anything new. I mean, what is creativity? Ian McGilchrist, a great scientist and friend, I would say, I hope he would agree, who I refer to a lot in my books, talks about creativity as bringing into being, the bringing into being of a new whole, a new gestalt. So how do you do that? How do you get to this new thing? To do that, you have to have a very broad kind of attention, a very open attention, and to look at the world around you as if everything is possibly a clue or something that might be of interest, like a bird picking up twigs to create a bird's nest. There's something, everything is relevant, for a while anyway, until you have to bring everything back into a new whole. And what happens is that you kind of incubate thoughts over quite a long period. You know this, if you've written a book, that and this has happened to me, is that you're entertaining 2, 3, 4, 5 things at once until they converge for you in your mind. And it's like, you've got a vague outline. It's in a cloud a bit, as Ian would put it. And then gradually, as the more time you let it sit with you, the clearer it becomes and the new whole emerges. And it's almost with creativity as if it's happening to you. So this is the nature of creativity. I think very few people understand that's how it works. We don't teach it in schools. No one talks about it very often. And so we end up in a world where creativity has become a sprint, that we go from here to here, and it minimizes risk and we know where we're going. It's linear. And it's not great creativity is actually requires a broad field, going beyond your category, going beyond your immediate point of interest to bring things in from outside. That's where, sparks of imagination happen. Great leaps happen that way, not just little iterative, sort of increments, but great leaps happen that way. And that's how great scientists often say that it happened. It was a long period of incubation and it hit them while they were getting on the bus with their shopping, that sort of thing. So that we need to remember that. And AI can perhaps help us to get there, and it is a collaborative thing, but don't rely on it too early on in the process, and make sure that you're doing some of that incubation and you're thinking about what's, the broadest possible field, and, use AI to maybe help you shape it if you want to, 'cause it can be very helpful in that way, bounce things off it. But I don't think it's going to come up with the ideas itself. It doesn't live in the world. It only lives vicariously through people. And, it doesn't know what it's like to get drunk on a Saturday night. So you are the one who understands human motivation. You live in the world. You are of the world. That's so important for communication.
And I think also you're selling to people, aren't you? I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, society is people. I mean, it's facilitated maybe by machines, but it's people. So understanding that human relation and the emotional piece of it is almost like it's almost like a last frontier to a certain extent, which isn't machine-led. I mean, it's not patterned. It's quite deep inside us.
Deep, lived, lived experience and movement, actually. That's the other thing AI doesn't have is the ability to move in the world. And from movement comes cognition as well. Cognition and movement together are very important. So, there are many ways in which AI is, I mean, it's brilliant in many ways, but it is limited still in others for the moment.
I love what you're saying there around sort of bringing ideas from different fields, and you see that in science, but also in business as well. It's like, how do you get ideas from different fields and sort of like bringing that together? And it's often the interface or the boundaries often where the interesting stuff happens, right? It's like how everything gets mixed up. But I do get a bit frustrated, which just come back to the transactional pieces where we're rushing to get an answer. And it's almost like I have this thing called brilliance of boredom, which is like sometimes I just need to get bored. And it's not until that kind of happens that it happens. And sometimes it just feels like we're on such a treadmill that we're constantly running for the answer, and AI will give us the answer quickly, but it'll just give us a vanilla answer. It won't give us necessarily that leap or insight in a way.
I think you're right. I mean, I've tried this with it, saying, what's the connection between these two different things? Is there any connection between these two different things? And what would it look like? That's an interesting question to ask, not just to give you the answer. It's about how you brief it, isn't it?
So where do you think we go from the future? So it seems like we've gone through this sort of salesmanship kind of period, and now we're hopefully, I mean, so you're advocating like seeing that sort of like showmanship piece coming back, and maybe it's got to do with the maturation of digital channels that we're going to have to do this to kind of pick and choose. What do you sort of see? Where do you think we're going to go in the future? How do you think it's going to evolve?
Well, it's becoming quite clear to people that if people are on social media, they're there first and foremost to entertain themselves. And so, as I always say, if you're going to put on a show, and you should if you want to grow, your show has to be more entertaining, more interesting, more arresting than anything else that surrounds you. Showmanship is important in the media that we're using today. But it's also going to become more important because as people move towards salesmanship and agentic AI and the ability to, if we've each got our own little sort of bot that knows our preferences and, tells us that this is the thing we need to buy. Would you like my help in buying it? Yes, please. Would you like me to choose between these two options? Yes, please. I imagine what the big tech companies will do is will create bots for us to buy whatever we want and it will get us there. That's salesmanship on steroids in a way. And so when salesmanship, when we sort of pivot towards salesmanship, you need to rebalance, and showmanship becomes more important because you've got to set those preferences. You've got to create that salience in the first place for people. The more you lean into salesmanship, the more important showmanship becomes. It may sound counterintuitive, but there is this sort of yin and yang balance, and showmanship should account for more of your spend. So I think it becomes more important. Whether people will recognize that or not, I don't know, but I think it will become more important.
Certainly my background's been much more pragmatic, data led, all those kind of things. But all of the conversations that we've been having, I suppose, it just makes me think around, like, you've got to think about how do people feel about things? What's the emotion? And I think it's been fascinating. It's been a bit of a journey for me, I think, Orlando. I must admit, but it's been fascinating. And I do appreciate you making the time to chat to me and
Absolute
sort of
pleasure.
explain some of it. I mean, hopefully, people take something new away, because it's a very sort of interesting kind of journey that we've been on. And you can see it's ebbing and flowing, and like where we are now, really. So I
Absolutely.
really appreciate it very much. I know you've got your course that's coming up. I think you've got a new intake that's coming
Yes,
up.
22nd of September. If you'd like to learn any more about this, how to make great advertising, how to make more effective advertising, and also just to learn a little bit about the psychology of it all, and which is more broadly applicable, I should say, then please do join. 8 Advertising Principles Explained.
Great. I'll make sure I got a link on that as well. Orlando, thanks very
Fantastic.
much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much.